The Montana Heritage Tour is a 6-part series featuring mostly small, rural museums. This project is a joint venture of the Montana Historical Society and Helena Civic Television. You can find cultural and historical treasures no matter which way you travel across the Big Sky state. The nice thing about starting in Helena is that when you drive out of town in any direction, you're going to find gold. Traveling west and then a bit south from Helena, travelers have good cause to pause for a good long time in Deer Lodge, the seat of Powell County and the site of a multiplex of fine museums. There's a Territorial prison, a world-famous car collection, and several other facilities dedicated to the traditions of the Old West. In all, there are 8.5 acres of museum spaces embedded in the heart of Deer Lodge. We met up with Julia Brewer, who manages the complex, in Desert John's Saloon, home to an original bar and, as you'll learn in just a bit, a rather extraordinary bartender.
We are standing inside Desert John's Saloon, which was when it was a working prison, up until 1979, was the old meal barn. And we are in the back portion of the Frontier Montana Museum, where we house the saloon collection. In its day, saloons were a place for, men to stop in and have a drink, to get a bath. Of course, there was the dancing girls that were a part of the component, and also the other things that went with the dancing girls. Bordellos were actually very common back in the late 1800s. Part of our mission statement as a nonprofit is adaptive reuse, and so all the buildings that the museums are housed in were actually part of the working prison, and many of the buildings served several functions. And then behind us on the corner is what we call the Boedeker Building, and that currently houses the Powell County Museum, and that is where we display local history, anything with some local interest. And that, when it was a working prison, housed female inmates in the basement. There was administrative offices in there, the laundry was in there, and there was also guards' quarters in the upper part of the Boedeker Building. Directly across the street to our north, we have yesterday's playthings, and that's currently our Daltorian Train Museum. But when this was a working prison, it was housed the deputy warden. There was meat cutting operations in there. There was a printing press in there at one point in time. So once again, it's adaptive reuse. It was part of the working prison, and then we turned it into a museum. If we go across the street, we have the old Montana prison with several buildings in there, and we operate that section as a museum, and people can go through and take a good hard look at prison life, what it was like back in the day. And it closed in 1979, so it's not that long ago when the people here were doing some hard time. And then we have the Montana Auto Museum, and that houses 153 very classic cars from the 1870s up into the 1970s, 7 decades of automotive history. Interestingly enough, our visitor center is where they have the industry area. They made mattresses and blue jeans in there. And then they also had a section where they housed some low security inmates, which is now part of the Auto Museum. And so we've taken 8.5 acres of this complex, and we have operated it as a museum to showcase our history. I can say that no 2 days are alike, and it is a challenge, but it's also very, very much a passion. I want to mention we are a nonprofit, and we don't receive state or federal funding, and so we work with a very slim budget to keep everything operating here, which in itself is a challenge. But you have to love what you're doing, and you have to love history, and you want to share it with our visitors that come in because they want to be here. What can we do to promote Deer Lodge as a community? We want to bring people in to see our museums because they're awesome, but also we want to bring people into Deer Lodge because Deer Lodge has a lot to offer, and so we're always thinking of special events. And so there's no 2 days are alike. It's a challenge. Sometimes it's sitting in the office answering messages to climbing up and seeing what we can do to repair a leaky roof. You know, there's a legend with this pinky missing on this bartender here, and we suspect that maybe he didn't pay a debt that was owed. It's a very historic bar. It came up in the late 1800s, 1870s to Deer Lodge, and it came up on a barge on the Mississippi River.
Don Cappa is responsible for an impressive collection of firearms inside the Frontier Museum building. Most of the guns on display here were manufactured by Colt, and there's a good reason for that.
Spent the last 65 years of my life collecting what we have here in the museum. This is a pretty good representation of what early Western history was really like. This collection started 65 years ago. My father was a basement cleaner and a junk man in San Francisco, and when he died, he had 6 weapons. So I picked up those 6 weapons, started studying the history, and became fascinated with history, Western museums, and started my collection. Traveled all over the country, dealt with other people who collected, garage sales, basements, auctions, and massed this collection that you see here today. Colt was the man who invented the revolver. In 1836, he was aboard a ship, and he saw the wheel turning, and he conceived the idea of putting a round cylinder in a weapon. And in 1836, he took his weapon to Eli Whitney, and Whitney made his first gun. And from that time on, the Colt won the West, if you will. It started in a progression of 1846 to a first model Dragoon, all the way down to 51 navies, 60 armies, and eventually progressed down to what we know as the Peacemaker. God created man, but Colt made him equal with this particular weapon. In the old day, it was cap and ball. You would have to load each cylinder individually. With this gun, you could put cartridges in and fire the gun from there. The cowboy loved his spurs, loved his Stetson hat. Those were his 2 favorite things, but he wanted to have a Colt. They all wanted Colts.
From Desert John's and the gun displays, we made our way to a jailhouse that predates the original Territorial prison. There's a lot to be said for staying out of the slammer. It's also good to see the humor in primitive justice and the inevitability of someone's demise. It's not unusual to meet up with some extraordinary characters working at Montana's small museums. Lemuel Ortman certainly fits the bill, and he graciously invited us into his blacksmithing barn.
I'm the resident blacksmith, and this is my blacksmith shop. I've been here for 8 years now. Blacksmithing is something I've always wanted to learn, and I went down to Santa Fe, New Mexico to learn under Frank Turley as a blacksmith school there. And I made a deal with the museum a year before I went down, and they said if I would go to blacksmith school and come back, they would give me a place to set up here, and so the rest is pretty much history. Well, a blacksmith moves iron around. Hot iron moves just like you would modeling clay, and you heat up iron, you pound it in all kinds of shapes, and at one time blacksmiths were a critical part of civilization, and still are to some degree as welders and stuff, but they made all your hard tools and stuff like that, plows and knives and shovels and stuff, and that's anything to do with metal, blacksmiths made them originally. I think it's in your blood. I find that as I do it, it just seems like it kind of wakes up more and more inside you, and I just really like pounding iron. And I'm no carpenter. If I was going to go build something out of wood, you would have a pile of firewood in one pile, and then you wouldn't have a house on your site. With iron, you make a mistake, you can just reheat it and pound it in and correct your mistake, which works for guys like me.
There's a lot more to see at this place than we were able to take in during a short visit. We'll have to go back. From Deer Lodge, we hooked north and west to reach Phillipsburg, and we encountered an interesting outdoor display on the way. Phillipsburg is the hub of Granite County and a place of sprightly, festive colors, restored historic storefronts, and well-heeled enthusiasts. Phillipsburg and its surroundings have an enduring legacy of mining for silver and black manganese, as well as the agriculture to support the mining industry. A good portion of the Granite County Museum addresses both of these interrelated chapters in regional history. Esther McDonald is a member of the museum's board of directors. She's been around a long time, having moved to Phillipsburg in 1953.
Our museum is depicting the early life of Phillipsburg. It's an old mining town dating back to 1864 when they discovered silver. And then we also mined black mag that was pure enough to go the batteries. We have a mining exhibit down and old machinery, old pictures at the basement museum. We have a model mine, but the upstairs is devoted to mostly the social life, the Moors of Phillipsburg, the school, the churches, a Chinese exhibit that is very nice, a logging exhibit, just everything that made our county as a natural resource county. We have a very nice exhibit of the Beaver Slide that a man at Jackson built us, and of course we don't make hay for the beaver slides anymore because we were round bale or square bales, but it attracts a lot of tourists because they don't know what these frames are all about at the fields. The mowers would mow the hay and they were windrowed, and the bull rakes would gather up the hay and put them on the forks of the Beaver Slide, and then the horses would pull up the forks, and about 4 men would spread the hay. One of my favorite exhibits is the Assay Office in the basement. And when I came here, there was an assay office in Phillipsburg, and the miners tested their ore before they shipped it.
One of the rarities at the Granite County Museum is a display devoted to Chinese immigrants. There were a lot of Chinese in Montana in the 1870s, helping to build railroads, work the mines, and tend to the needs of urban settlers. In 1882, President Chester A. Arthur signed an act of Congress entitled the Chinese Exclusion Act. It prohibited all immigration of Chinese laborers. This infamous piece of legislation remained on the books until 1943, and no doubt is the major reason for the near absence of Chinese American families in Montana in recent decades. We met up with Lynn Schockseneider in the old school section of the museum. She reinforced the common sense reality that museums are learning places and bookstores to boot.
I enjoy the history of the area. I try to read and talk to people who've lived here forever. There's one gentleman here in town who is on our board, and he's talked to me about a lot of things, so I've gleaned a lot just from what he's told me about local history and just different things. And if I have questions, I ask Esther. So that when somebody else comes in, I can say, yes, here is the answer to this. I really enjoy all the old photography or all the old pictures because I'm a photography buff myself. People really enjoy buying books and they like to read, and I do sell a fair amount of books. We have a few, well, I shouldn't call them novels, but they are some nonfiction. We have several books on the ghost towns in Montana. And people like those. They like to know the history of a particular area. And I've had a lot of people come in from out of state and they go right and they say, we want these books because our grandfather used to live at Granite, or our grandfather used to live here in town, or our grandmother was married here, or we think that somebody has died here in our family tree. So those books have been very popular. Down in the mining room, every once in a while, our little buzzer will go off because we have a security camera, and you look at the TV and you find out it's the neighbor's black and white cat who comes in down below. And we all get a kick out of that. I was told that when I first started working, watch out for the cat. I said, the cat? Sure enough, the cat comes in there, just cruises around. One day he had his legs up on a cabinet and then he goes out. I've never locked him in yet. So that's kind of my little humorous thing I like.
Our next stop on the Heritage Tour was in Hamilton. The only direct route from Phillipsburg to there is over the Skalkaho Pass, which is actually an ancient Indian trail turned into a lovely winding mountain road that's closed in the winter but spectacular in summer. There's a waterfall at the apex before you make your descent into the agricultural splendor of the Bitterroot Valley. Tamar Stanley is the curator at the Ravalli County Museum. The museum is housed in the old courthouse.
The museum is now housed in a building that was built in 1900 and designed by A.J. Gibson, who is a famous architect from Montana and did most of the public buildings in the Missoula area and the Bitterroot Valley. Currently on display, we have a fabulous collection of art and science that was developed in collaboration with the Rocky Mountain Laboratories, local schools, community artists, and our in-house historians. So the Rocky Mountain Lab created the images that you see behind me, and a lot of the art pieces that are around the room were created by the scientists that work at the lab, trying to show the beauty of the deadly diseases that they work on every day here in the Bitterroot Valley. Rocky Mountain Lab has never entered into a collaboration like this before, so we were quite gratified to be able to showcase these kinds of unusual images and have our public and our residents and our tourists from outside of Montana be able to see the deadly beauties. One of the things that we enjoy most here at the Ravalli County Museum is the opportunity to layer on to rotating and traveling exhibits pieces from our permanent collection. In this instance, when we began the collaboration with Rocky Mountain Laboratories, which is unique in the region and in the state of Montana, to combine science and art and historical aspects of both of those into an exhibit of this caliber. Our permanent collection includes a lot of the Thomas More art from the early 1900s. Most of his collection is now in the Smithsonian, but the Ravalli County Museum has a select group of views of the Thomas More collection. Here also you will see old microscopes that are just artistic in their utility. The views that are displayed behind me of the images of diseases and pathogens, microscopy is very interesting to the public to be able to see. So one of the most unusual aspects about having a level 5 installation here in Hamilton, Montana is because that was where the Rocky Mountain spotted fever was originally discovered. Rocky Mountain Labs was developed in 1924 to try to provide a vaccine for a very deadly disease that was becoming well known throughout the region and the United States. The scientists at Rocky Mountain Laboratories realized that in the Bitterroot Valley there was an abundance of ticks and several different species of ticks that were carrying the Rocky Mountain spotted fever. As they started to experiment with vaccines, they were able to isolate the pathogens that were creating such a disastrous result in the Bitterroot Valley in Rocky Mountains and beyond. In this room, you find a representation of the Bertie Lord glass plate collection. He was an early immigrant to the Bitterroot Valley in 1896 and was one of the first settlers that made an impact on the history of the valley. He recorded a great deal of the Valley's history through his photographic images, and we have his entire glass plate collection housed here at the Ravalli County Museum. Bertie Lord was instrumental in highlighting the aspects of the stereoptic viewer, which allowed people to see images in 3D. In this case, we have interactive kids exhibits where they're allowed to see how 3D was originally conceived and utilized throughout the early 18 and mid 1900s. Bertie Lord's stereo views and cabinet cards were very popular in the late 1800s and early 1900s. It allowed people from back east to be able to understand what the Wild West looked like and allowed them to become interested in landscape and the rural lifestyle that was part of Montana at the time.
Even in this age of digital cameras and digital pictures, the background stories of photo image evolution are fascinating. Inside and out of the heat of the summer, you can cover a lot of ground in history in just a short space of time and real estate.
We're standing in what used to be the old county attorney's office, and of course today in our museum is one of our favorite exhibits. This is the walk through the Bitterroot Room. So the murals on the walls are all painted to look replicating the Bitterroot Valley in 1900, which is the same year actually that this building was built as the old courthouse. At the time, Hamilton was the county seat, still is today, and this was really the center of law and justice kind of back in that early 1900s. So this room, the concept for this exhibit is sort of that it's a joined exhibit. This room up here is called the Darby Room, and it focuses on the logging industry and also the irrigation and the forthcoming agricultural industry, specifically sugar beets and apples. In the valley. The museum today, and kind of a nod to that apple growing history, we still do have apple growing families in the valley. This room, going from Darby, is the Hamilton Room. The idea being that if you had been working on the logging industry at the turn of the century, you would have put your logs up onto the railroad and come up the valley with your logs. So you can see here this railroad line going from the train station in Darby up to Hamilton. And of course, what used to be Hamilton in the background there in the 1900s certainly has changed a lot. This room really focuses on the early industries of Hamilton. In this case here, we can see a lot of the agricultural tools that were used up actually until fairly recently. So I sometimes give tours to some older folks, and they remember using these things, in their daily lives, and that's always kind of fun. I sometimes wonder what the museums are going to be like when I'm 70 years old, and maybe I'll see a telephone or a cell phone in a display case somewhere. And then up on the wall, these two folks, of course, are Marcus and Margaret Daly. Marcus Daly was one of the infamous copper kings in early Montana, his contentious rival being William Clark, and really influenced a lot of the political history of the state. Sometimes Marcus Daly, I've heard him kind of branded as a nice guy or a man of the people, and I guess my personal opinion is, that one of the reasons that Montana was the first state to have the blind ballot, one of the first states to have the blind ballot, is because Marcus Daly actually fired his workers if they voted the way that they wanted to vote. One of the more interesting features in this exhibit, which I love to show children coming to the museum because it's such a huge change about how we today function and how we used to in the past, we actually have a sheep or dog powered treadmill. And I know that if I put my dog on there, he would hop off. He would not walk and generate power. But this treadmill actually evidently was used to kind of create and then store. Power would be stored. I feel that small local museums are important because they're kind of the bread and butter of cultural life in a lot of our small towns.
The positive economic of museums is noteworthy, even if easily overlooked, And adding to the cultural and educational enrichment theme, Elizabeth reported the fact that over 1,000 young people in school groups visited the facility in the past year. For some students, especially in small schools, a field trip to the museum can be the highlight of their school year.
For the kids to come here, for them to see these things that are enriching and help them understand the cultural context that they're living in today is invaluable. I think that even just learning what a museum is and how to behave in a museum and how we act, that social knowledge is a really important piece of it. And on the adult end of that, every time we have an exhibit, every time we have a lecture, people don't just come to the museum for that one thing. They'll often find themselves going out to dinner or going shopping or frequenting our downtown district. So I think the economic impact of museums is huge, especially in small towns like this.
The diversity of subject matter at the Ravalli County Museum is stunning. Who knew that the Bitterroot Valley was a mecca for aficionados of Macintosh apples? Who would think that stereo-optical devices would be invented by a Montana photographer? Who would expect to learn about microscopy and Rocky Mountain spotted fever in a place like this? One sure thing, it's always better to see ticks behind glass than in the out of doors. In the next episode of the Montana Heritage Tour, we'll head to Beaverhead County, the town of Whitehall, and then go clear over to Lewistown in the center of the state.
They are the farmers, the miners, the timber workers and millwrights, the small business owners and the captains of industry. They are the hands and the minds, the shoulders and the backs that made Montana. And we're proud to say that we see them in more than just museums. We see them in the people we continue to serve today. Montana State Fund, proud supporter of Montana's museums and the Montana Historical Society.